questions. This was always conceived as two films from the very beginning, right?
Yes, yes. It wasn't an afterthought. When I decided to tell the story, I knew that it had to be told in two parts. And the only thing I was worried about is that I had to shoot the first part first and then wait a year to shoot the second part. And I was worried that if I didn't shoot them together, we originally planned to film them together, but we couldn't raise the money to shoot them at the same time. I thought there'd be a danger that I wouldn't get to shoot the second part. And for me, the first part isn't possible without the second part, and vice versa. They are two stories. Well, they're one story told in two films.
Yeah. But I know this is a story, a film you've been thinking about for literally decades. You started thinking about this in the late 80s. So even then you knew this was going to be a two-part film?
Well, I only realized because I was looking back when I was making the first part, a lot of what I did when I was preparing for it and writing it was looking at old diaries of mine. And I hadn't realized until I started looking at a diary from 1988 that I had wanted to tell the story in two parts.
So can you talk a little bit about how you conceptualized the relationship between part one and part two? I mean, part one is pretty clearly about the relationship. Part two is about after the relationship. I mean, it's how would you characterize, I mean, the relationship of part two to part one?
There's many different ways of looking at it, but back in 1988, which is a long time ago, I saw it, and I still see it like this in a way, as telling the story of the relationship, and then the response and the reaction to the relationship. But in some ways, when I started making part two and planning part two, I realized that also what I was doing was telling a story of the making of part one.
Yeah. So did that gap change anything for you? I mean, as you said, you finished part one, released it, put it out into the world, talked about it, before you went back to part two, which is not how you initially, thought you would make the film. So did that gap, did that change anything in terms of what you wanted to do in part two? Just having that already be out in the world, having talked about it, listened to reactions and.
Well, I was worried about that gap actually, and I decided when part one came out that I wouldn't read any reactions to it, which I didn't. But of course, I couldn't completely isolate myself from any reactions from anybody, so I heard things secondhand, and I was worried that even hearing opinions that it would somehow shape what I did with part two, but. I'm not as sort of sensitive maybe as I think I am on some level, and I could hear those things, but at the same time I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do with part two, and in the end I'm really glad that I didn't shoot the two films together, because there's so many ideas that I got in that gap of a year. So many ideas I'm all forgotten now actually, but I know some very key things that I put into part two that I wouldn't have done if I shot them at the same time. And one of the ideas I had was the film within the film that Julie makes. I don't think I'd thought about that when I was first planning to make the second part. So that in that year I had a lot of new ideas.
Let's talk about that film within the film, her graduation film. I know that, obviously this is, you in part one, I assume in part two as well, you worked with a lot of documentary material in a sense to really, to create this film, this fiction. Does Julie's graduation film that we see in this film bear any resemblance to yours?
In a key way, not actually, and in one important way that it doesn't resemble it is that Julie in part two makes the film based on her relationship with Anthony, and in a way that film within a film that I made is a sort of wishful thinking or was a chance to make something that I wish I'd made when I was at film school. I wasn't yet equipped when I was still at film school to even examine in any shape or form the relationship that I'd been through, on which part one is based. But I decided that Julie would have some awareness of this experience that she'd been through. But then it was also the experience of making part one and how I felt reconstructing the flat that I lived in and reconstructing this relationship in a way. I wanted to examine that. So it was just many different things colliding at the same time. It's quite hard to pull it apart at this point.
Was your working process the same for part two, in terms of how you work with actors? And maybe we should actually just even say a little bit about your working process, which is quite unconventional in that you don't have conventional scripts. Should we say a bit about how you work with that?
I can try and try not to expand for too long about it, but yeah, it really with part one. Well, each time I make a film, I write a document that's about 30 pages long. That's more like a short story in a way. And with part one, Honor, who plays Julie, didn't see anything on paper at all. She didn't. All she knew was a little bit about the character that she was going to play. She had no idea of the story that was going to unfold. She was incredibly brave to agree to participate in something of which she knew very little about. She could only trust me, in a sense, and trust her own instincts. But Tom Burke, who plays Anthony, was privy to the document that I wrote, and also a lot more he listened to recordings of the man that he was basing his character on. He got a lot of information from me about this story. He knew exactly where it was going, and that just seemed right to me, that he knew where the story was going, and Julie wouldn't. But when we made part two, of course, this was also without Anthony. Julie was on her own, and I thought, well, Julie now needs to know where she's going. She does know where she's going. She wants to be a filmmaker. So she then saw the story. She knew where it was going to go. And so I think that's quite a big difference in terms of the process. And then she, Honor, took it in her own direction, in the sense that I realized that she'd been observing me during the making of part one. And so when she's playing Julie, directing as a film student, it was very strange. I sometimes saw myself, wasn't very flattering, but so she was incredibly clever in her observations, and she kept that to herself in a way. I'm not sure she was fully aware of what she'd been doing, but anyway, it was interesting.
You've talked about, in part one, just going back and looking at photographs and letters and notes from the time. Did you do the same for part two, or was there more invention, or what was, did you find? I'm curious also because it's interesting that how you go into this film school, environment, which is again so precisely depicted in the film.
Yeah, well, no, it's true. There was a lot more invention in part two. I didn't feel constrained by this relationship that's depicted in the first part. I was excited to explore areas that I hadn't explored as a director before. And I sort of began life at film school making much more stylized, almost theatrical work. And I thought it would be really interesting and fun. And it was fun to go back to being that film student again, in a way. So I sort of transported myself back to the 80s. I felt quite sad in a way that it was just a dream and not really, I wasn't really transported back then. But what am I trying to say? I felt a fondness for that time and the creativity and inventiveness of that time and the potential that one had as a filmmaker.
Is Richard Ayoade's character based on anyone in particular?
he's not just based on one person. He's a sort of amalgam of different directors I've come across, even a little bit of myself in there too. So I can't, yeah, it's not just one person, but he had a lot of fun with that role.
Yeah, I'll just ask one more, and then we'll take a few from the audience. I'm wondering if you I don't want to say reference points, but this very fraught project of autobiography, of autofiction that that the Souvenir is, like, did you think of other people who had attempted this? Did you think of what to do, what not to do? What are the traps of a project like this? What did you want to avoid? And yeah, was anyone on your mind in terms of somebody who actually mined their own lives, put it on screen?
No one comes to mind, and I'm not sure if anyone came to mind at the time. And I think if I'd explored it too much, I might have put myself off, actually. So I try not to think of it as so acutely personal when I'm making the film. And in a strange way, once I've written it, even writing it in the strange way I do it, and then I start to cast it, and then I have all my wonderful collaborators working with me, like my cinematographer and my production designer and my editor. It doesn't feel like it's coming from me anymore in a strange way. So I'm very interested in collaboration and seeing what other people bring to something. And in a way, it seems strange to take a story that happened to me in a similar way to the story that happens to Julie, but take something very personal and then sort of let go of it. For me, the letting go is really important.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. I'll just try to paraphrase that. There was the scene. The question is about the scene in the van, the argument, and whether those dynamics are still in play for you on a film set these days.
Yeah, fortunately not. But there's always anxiety around. You always, question the ideas you have or how they're going to be experienced or how they're going to be understood by other people. So it's a sort of externalization of one's anxieties, maybe. But I think I'm maybe that was more. It's more connected to when I was a film student. I think we behave better now, we're grown-ups. So that's, certainly if anyone's feeling that, they're not telling me to my face.
Okay, yes, right here. The question is, apparently in interviews that you read about films more than you watch films.
Actually, I wouldn't say that I read more than I watch films, but I think in terms of getting inspiration for what I do, I feel freer if I read I guess it has to be something good or something well written that's got interesting ideas in it. But I find, I'm trying to think of an example. The British Film Institute in London, for example, do these, and you probably do a similar thing here. They do bring out very detailed booklets of films. So that, there's one that they brought out about Fellini's 8.5, for example. And although I watched 8.5 again before I made The Souvenir, particularly Part II, I read this booklet. It was like I just sort of pored over it. It was just so interesting to me, and it was sort of quite academic ideas about the film. But I don't know. There's a freedom anyway in reading about ideas for something, and of course it connects with the fact that I know the film anyway. But I wouldn't say the reading replaces watching films, not at all. But in terms of if I'm working on ideas, and I don't tend to watch a lot of films when I'm writing something of my own, but I feel I'm able to read. Yeah.
Were there other films you watched besides 8.5?
Well, I made the decision to watch films that I was inspired by when I was at film school, when I made my graduation film, which inspired Part II. So I watched Mitchell Lyson's Lady in the Dark, because that was a film I loved back then. I watched Cover Girl by Charles Vidor, Ticket of No Return, Ulrich Oettinger. I don't know, all these films that I was obsessed by when I was a film student. And I thought, well, I'm interested in being in that zone of the early 1980s and what, to somehow color the film and also create a sense of that time.
Okay, I think we can take a couple more. Yes? Question is about the visual style and shooting on film in a digital world.
Well, I mean, the choice of 16 millimeter, and it's not just 16 millimeter in the film. There are some parts of particularly when Julie's making her graduation film, we shot that in digital, partly because I knew that I wanted to have quite long takes for those scenes, but also I was interested in mixing up the format. So there's the black and white musical that Patrick, Richard's character, makes, that's 35 millimeter. But yeah, most of it's 16 millimeter, you're right. And that, I thought, I wanted that texture, and also that's what I used. I shot mostly on 16 millimeter when I was at film school. So again, it was to do with that time. And then the Super 8, well, I had a Nitso myself, so I have a certain affection for that camera. So it made sense in that way. But then I also included some Super 8 that I shot from the 1980s. So it's quite mixed up. I wanted it to have different textures, not just one texture.
Okay, let's take one last question. Yes, sir. This question is about the shots of nature. Yeah, they're interspersed throughout the film.
I think that came from, it wasn't a very specific idea in the sense that it wasn't to do with the theme really, but it was to do with home. And I shot, the garden scenes are actually shot in my mother's garden. So there was something about my mother there, who sadly passed away in March. So I used the garden before she died, but there was a connection of Rosalind's character and Julie's parents because in part 1 we don't have so much of home, and in part 2 we do. And so the flowers really came from my mother's garden. It's not really more complicated than that, but it felt like they felt like a little bit like chapter headings to me.
I think I'm getting the sign to wrap up. So that's all the time we have for, I'm afraid, but thank you all for coming. Joanna, thanks so much.
Thank you.